Buona giornata. Diamo inizio alla Lectio Magistralis di Sebern Fischer. Porto i saluti del professor Giuliano Geminiani, direttore del Dipartimento di Psicologia, che mi ha chiesto di manifestare la sua soddisfazione per la presenza della professoressa Fischer nel nostro Ateneo e il suo interesse per la materia, e si scusa perché purtroppo non può essere assente. E così io mi associo a questa calda e sentita accoglienza della professoressa Sebern Fischer. Ci onora davvero la sua presenza e avremo occasione di essere introdotti a questa metodica di lavoro sui traumi, che è un intervento di frontiera, ma ormai molto approfondito dalla professoressa che è nostra ospite. Quindi la ringrazio per la sua presenza, per la sua partecipazione, e do la parola alla dottoressa Maria Teresa Molo, che come presidente della Fondazione Molo ha invitato la professoressa Fischer, e adesso avrà occasione di presentarla.
Un saluto a tutti a nome della Fondazione e innanzitutto un grosso ringraziamento da parte nostra a Sebern Fischer, che ha accettato l'invito ed è venuto in Italia a spiegarci questo suo metodo di lavoro che combina psicoterapia e neurofeedback, quindi due aspetti diversi della mente e della personalità umana. L'abbiamo invitata proprio perché è un'esperta che dal 97 ha cominciato a lavorare col neurofeedback e poi, trovandosi di fronte ai traumi, ha cominciato a combinare questi due aspetti, come dicevo, di psicoterapia e neurofeedback, con ottimi risultati. Ci spiegherà appunto cosa ci sta alla base di questo approccio e anche alcune sue esperienze pratiche del suo lavoro. Ha scritto recentemente questo libro, che non è stato ovviamente ancora tradotto in italiano perché è uscito da poco. Neurofeedback in the Treatment of Developmental Trauma, Calming the Fear-Driven Brain, e questo può essere acquistato, come avete visto nel foglio del programma, anche tramite web dalla casa che lo distribuisce, con uno sconto sul prezzo, digitando questo codice WNWEB, in cui si richiede appunto il codice. È un libro molto interessante che consiglio vivamente e che mi auguro tutti voi vorrete leggere e studiare. Abbiamo una grossa opportunità di conoscere questa metodica così efficace. E ora passo la parola alla professoressa Fischer. Vorrebbe sapere chi di voi conosce l'inglese, capisce l'inglese, se volete alzare la mano.
Oh, good. Okay, so thank you very much. This is somewhat of a trust exercise for me because I speak no Italian, so I have no idea what anybody is saying. But I hope you will know what I'm saying. That's the important thing. And the rest is going to be just trusting you. And you can ask questions at the end. It's like, okay. I usually talk a lot about how I got into this. I'm not going to do that so much because of the language. I'm going to stay on my slides, but we can talk more about it. If you ask me about it, I'm happy to tell you the story of how I got into neurofeedback. I never would have expected to be the one speaking to you about using a computer with the brain, but here I am. So that's the book. All right, we have to get, what's this? Okay, that's right, doesn't it? And this is my interest is primarily in working with trauma and attachment problems in children, adolescents, and adults with neurofeedback, but not neurofeedback along with psychotherapy. My background is primarily in psychodynamic psychotherapy, but I also was the first person to implement dialectical behavior therapy, do you know DBT, into a residential treatment facility in the United States. So I know DBT, and I know psychodynamic, I know some psychoanalytic principles. It all folds together, all comes together in the brain. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about. Okay. So the very first thing that we want to know is that the brain organizes itself electrically by the rhythms, by the frequencies at which it fires. It's not chemical. The money is in the chemicals, but the brain is primarily about how it fires, what the electrical function is of the brain. And we'll talk more about this. But that's the very first thing, is to understand that the brain communicates, organizes itself, dependent on the way it fires. And this is what we are going to be appealing to when we put the sensors on the head and we put a computer in front of the patient. We will be saying, change the way your brain fires, and they can learn to do that. Cats learn to do it, and monkeys learn to do it, and humans can learn to do it. Okay? All right. So that's the very first principle. The second principle that I'm concerned about is regulation of emotion, right? How we feel drives everything. Are you with me? Okay. So the important thing for me, and for those of you who are interested in attachment and trauma, is what part of the brain is creating what frequencies that are creating trouble for this person, creating bad behavior, difficult thinking, but mostly affect problems, like Alan Shore. Have you read Alan Shore? Anyone here read Alan Shore? Okay. So, his whole thesis is that you need to have regulation of emotion, affect regulation, to be able to develop a sense of self and a sense of other. That affect regulation is in the frequency domain of the brain, all right? So it organizes itself. The ability to regulate affect in the brain has a frequency dimension, right? Is this making sense? Okay. So that's neurofeedback. We're going to discuss what it is, and I'm going to show you a film of somebody with neurofeedback. And then I'm going to discuss how I put neurofeedback and psychotherapy together a little bit, okay? That's a long topic. Okay, so when I began my work as a psychotherapist, everyone believed that you were born with the amount of brain cells that you were ever going to have, and it was downhill from there. Like by the time you were 3, it was all downhill in terms of brain function. There was no concept of plasticity of brain function. It didn't exist. So the idea that we can change the way our brains organize themselves is new. It's 10 years, maybe. And that's called the brain is considered to be plastic. Okay. So if you accept the premise, which is a true premise, that that the brain organizes itself in these rhythms, what we are saying is you can get access to this plasticity or this brain function through giving the brain information on how it's firing and on inviting your patient to change the way it fires, which they can do. Cats can do it, monkeys can do it, humans can do it. Even very troubled human beings can do this. Even people have had success with schizophrenia, bipolar illness, with doing neurofeedback. That's not the group that I work with. Primarily, again, I work with people with trauma histories, developmental trauma histories, early childhood trauma. Okay, so really neurofeedback is a form of biofeedback, all right? All you'll see it in the film. It is also the premise that almost every major mental health problem that we have has affect regulation in it, dysregulation of affect, right? No matter what we call it, whatever the DSM calls it, it's not a book I'm very fond of. I don't pay too much attention to the DSM. But even if the DSM, if you look in there, there's always some reference to affect regulation. It's an issue in all mental illness. Okay. Primarily, shame, fear, and rage. Okay. The eruptions of these rage, shame, and fear create major problems for the people who are trying to manage that brain. And they end up in jail or in mental hospitals or in some kind of situation of constraint. Those were my patients at the residential treatment facility. That's what we're trying to do. Is it possible to quiet those limbic eruptions? And what we have found is, yes, it is possible to do that. And then, as those of you who have had any experience doing psychotherapy, you know that it's very difficult to do therapy if your major task is regulating the other person. It's just getting them to sit still in the room and talk to you. Then this neurofeedback makes that much more available. Okay, everybody still with me? More or less? Okay. All right. So, all mental illness can be seen as a failure in the brain's capacity to control these powerful and persistent firing of the limbic brain. So, I don't know how many of you do you know the work of Dan Siegel? You know that name, Dan Siegel? Okay. So when he talks about the brain, he talks about this as the limbic brain, and so it's tucked down, right, on the brain, on the back, on the brainstem, and then this is the cortical brain, and this is what we hope is calling the shots, not the thumb, but the top of the brain. In our patients, it's the limbic brain that is so powerful and is not being appropriately shut down by the cortex, particularly the front of the brain. Okay, so what that does is that leads to problems with executive function. So problems with memory, with thinking clearly, with with being in relationship, most importantly with being in relationship, but cognitive functions, control of your behavior, and to be in fulfilling relationships. It's all problematic when you're being run by the limbic part of your brain. The trauma survivor, particularly children who have been neglected, neglect is an important part of this, and or abused sexually or physically or emotionally, are all too often just flooded by shame and rage and fear, okay? And controlled by them. They don't have a sense of self, really, that is separate from what they feel. Right? Okay? And this is most clear in PTSD and in developmental trauma. So developmental trauma is just a new term that is replacing attachment disorder, and it's replacing PTSD in these children who are so impacted in so many different ways. Okay? All right. So, so this is the brain that we're looking at, and you can see the blue section. That's the amygdala. That's the part of the brain that we're most concerned about shutting down and controlling, with having the person be able to quiet their own amygdala firing. I'm not going to do that to them. They are going to learn to do that for themselves. And the way they're going to learn to do that is with practice with neurofeedback. You can see the part, we don't have a laser pointer. Sorry, I didn't think. So the part that we're most concerned about is the prefrontal cortex being able to shut down the PTSD circuit, and that's this blue circuit in the middle of the brain, including the hippocampus and the amygdala are the primary parts of the brain that we're concerned with. They're and the amygdala even more the driver of these very difficult emotional states. All right, so in fMRI, there are fMRI people here, correct? fMRI people? Yeah, you, okay? Yes, yes. Okay, so this is an fMRI of what's called now being called the default mode network. So what this is this part of the brain and this part of the brain, the cingulates in between. This is important even if you're only a therapist and not a neurologist, this is going to be important. And the whole self system, the parts of the brain that says, I exist, I am real, you are you, I am me, sits in this place where you see all the blood flow and the fMRI. So what you are seeing here is this is a patient who is normal, right? No trauma, and they have been told by this researcher, I'm going out for a cup of cappuccino, I'll be back. And what happens then is that people start thinking about themselves. So this is an fMRI representation of somebody thinking about themselves. They're thinking about what they had for breakfast, they wish they didn't eat that much, or that who are they going to see tonight, or whatever. It's a biographical representation of the self. And every one of you, if I said, I'm going to give you a few minutes here, would be thinking about yourselves. That's just normal. That's healthy. Okay. So, and that's what it looks like. So if we caught it on an fMRI, we saw you thinking about yourself. This is what it would look like. Robust blood flow. That's blood flow that you're seeing. Okay. So this is normal, and this is what it looks like if you have severe developmental trauma. That's the brain that's the self system in the brain of somebody who has no self. In the Alan Shore sense of the word, has no self. So when the researcher says, I'm going to go and get a cappuccino, and they scan their brains, there isn't a sense of self. There's no blood flow, because they literally don't have a sense of self. And we can see it. We have proof. And this is what we want to change, right? People are exploring changing this with fMRI, just teaching people how to change blood flow. Much easier and cheaper to do this with grazie. All right, now I'll see if I can do it. Okay, terrific. Okay, so now you know that this is a profound disorder, right? I mean, and this is what it looks like if you have been abused, neglected as a child. This is what, there isn't a self system. There's no blood flow here. Look at all of that good blood flow up there. Okay. So we want to be able to change that in the brain, because if we just try to change that with psychotherapy, who are we talking to? Who is the who? Who's there? Okay. All right, so this is a slide from Bessel van der Kolk. You know van der Kolk? Okay, so he's a trauma researcher. And this is fMRI, this is a PET scan actually, of somebody who has been read, the researcher has read a trauma script. They have given this person, okay, let me say this well. So the patient in the scanner has given a script that will create a flashback, right? The researcher reads the script while they are in the scanner, right? So that they can try to capture what happens in the brain when you have a flashback. Yeah, all know the term flashback? Okay, so what's happening here? So this is reversed. This is the right side of the brain right here, the right hemisphere, okay, this side. So all of the action, when there's a flashback, this is all the amygdala. This is all the right hemisphere. We call it the survival amygdala. That's what's firing. And when you'll notice the left frontal, which is the verbal part, there's nothing happening. This is where we do verbal therapies, are coming through the left front of the brain. But in high periods of distress, that part of the brain is shut down completely. Okay? And it won't always be shut down, but if you have no self and you have all too often, no left frontal hemisphere operating because you are in such deep distress, it's hard to understand how talk therapies are going to help. And I've had that experience, most of us have. It's also showing in this that the occipital area, the visual area, is showing up because they're actually seeing something in a flashback. Most flashbacks, not all. Okay. This is just to show you, this is a slide from a researcher in Australia named Sandy McFarlane. And what it is showing is that in people without trauma, this is just so they've been given a stimulus, a benign stimulus. It could be, somebody dropping their phone on the floor, okay? And in normals, you see how well organized this. So here's the moment of the stimuli, and this is the way the brain. And see how organized that is, right? It just looks organized. Okay, so you take people with PTSD. And you drop the phone on the floor, and they have a response, and it's a completely disorganized response in PTSD. Okay, these were all, as I think, adults. So the cortical timing, the timing that is so important for brain organization, the timing that's in the frequencies in the brain, is off completely in those people with PTSD compared to controls. Right? Are we all with me? Okay. All right, so some of you have read Alan Shore. This is important. What he says is that the relationship with the mother organizes the brain of her infant. Okay? So this is breakthrough attachment stuff. Eye to eye, heart to heart, holding and rocking, prosody, the tone of the voice. Motherese is a term that's used, the song of the mother's voice, okay? She's trying to soothe the infant or talking to the infant. There's a lot of song in the way a mother talks to her baby. Soothing and attunement, allowing the baby to turn away when it's time to turn away. There's a lot to this dance of attachment. And that whole process begins the development of the prefrontal cortex. So it's not just that it's a lovely experience between mother and child, it's that it actually builds the brain. Okay. It is this part of the brain that inhibits the limbic firing. So if that doesn't set up, if that doesn't happen because of neglect or trauma, this part of the brain won't be available to shut down the limbic brain, the fear and the shame and the rage. So if it's not available, what happens? Shame and rage and fear rule the person. Person is in fear and shame and rage all the time. When it does happen, when there is good enough mothering, and the prefrontal cortex does develop, this begins to develop the capacity for regulation of emotion, affect regulation, and the understanding, I am me, you are you, which should develop by around 2 or 3. And that 2 or 3 years old, and that is a sign of the maturing of the prefrontal cortex. Okay? All right. I just will trust you will ask me later if you don't understand what I've said. This is my daughter and my granddaughter. And you can see she's now 8 years old. And she's staring right at her mother's right hemisphere. She's looking for signals. she's not looking at her face full on, she's looking right at her right hemisphere, and she's looking at it because she's just picking up what the emotional registry is. She's trying to figure out what her mother, they're in the dance. So, you know John Bowlby? Okay, so John Bowlby talked about the baby internalizing the mother's regulation. So it wasn't, it's a learning. He learned it, right? And John Bowlby had poor attachment experiences himself. Okay, so you probably know that. Okay, so he was trying to figure out the importance of attachment, and he made major contributions. Alan Shore then comes along, not that long ago, and talks about what we were just saying, that the mother's regulation actually builds prefrontal cortex, actually builds neuronal structure in the front of the brain. And the right prefrontal cortex, so on the right side, that's what that baby is looking at, and what the mother's looking at, right? Is they are checking each other's emotional brains out. That's where the action is. That's what's important. I need to know I am safe with my mom, okay? And she is. It's good. Okay. All right. So, unrepaired attachment disruption, in my opinion, right? This is my opinion, is at the core of most serious psychopathology. So we have attachment problems at the center of almost all, not schizophrenia or bipolar illness, but definitely most other serious pathology. Not Asperger's either, or autism. But there is, in most mental illnesses, a core unrepaired attachment disruption. And it leaves the baby in a state of she's disorganized, and she lives in in a baseline survival fear. So she's afraid all the time, okay? This is the condition that we're talking about, where no self and no other develop, okay? And when fear and its neighbors, shame and rage, rule, that's when we see psychopathology. And to me, the one that we need to be concerned about the most, and that what people are using drugs for, both prescribed drugs and street drugs, is to deal with fear. The greatest of these is fear. Okay? All right, so when I asked an adult patient of mine if she would draw a picture of herself, right? So this is what I'm going to show you a video of her at the end. But that was her self-representation. This is a 50-year-old woman with a terrible trauma history, all right? That's no self, wouldn't you say? Do you agree? Okay. I don't see any self in there at all. And the little bit that started to organize, she crossed out. You see that little bit there? Then it's crossed out, and I don't know what the rest of it looks a little like a cockroach, right? That's what she thought of herself. Okay. All right. So when you are ruled by this overwhelming emotion and dysregulation, the distortions in thought and the dysfunctional behaviors suggest that we can't rely only on talk therapy with these patients. We have to get to their brains. And we can't do that successfully with medications. Medications don't work to organize the brain. They only work to mute or to quiet the symptoms, but they don't do anything to organize the brain, or very rarely. The survival amygdala, as we talked about, was in the right. That hemisphere is nonverbal. So if I took the left hemisphere offline altogether, we go back to that slide with Bessel, I would not be able to know in Italian or English what anybody was saying. The right hemisphere is nonverbal. The problem that these patients are having is in the right hemisphere. We can't address it by talking to the left hemisphere. We have got to somehow get to quieting the right, okay? And that's the part of the brain, the right hemisphere is the part of the brain that is devoted to the regulation of affect, or emotional regulation. And talk is processed in the left frontal, the left hemisphere. We're getting into those details. You're doing great up there. Okay. All right, so generally speaking, what we're doing with neurofeedback is we train down, we give the brain a choice of frequencies that will quiet it, okay? It's the best way to say it. I mean, so we train the brain not to make the frequencies that lead to high arousal, and that process helps to quiet fear. Okay. As I said, this can be the goal even in psychosis. I have a colleague in Istanbul, a psychiatrist in Istanbul, who treats homeless schizophrenics. They come every day for neurofeedback on their own. That's unheard of for any treatment, right? Okay, hopefully you know what I said. All right, okay, so well, no. What just happened here? All right, John? Huh?
It's better and it's safer and it's less invasive than any chemicals or even natural therapies.
But he suffered ADHD, and the violence he unleashed on his family made their lives a nightmare. At least that's the way things used to be. But now, what was a home from hell couldn't be happier. The family say it's all thanks to a breakthrough treatment for ADHD, which does not require drugs.
Hey, don't pull the garage apart! He would smash everything, he would throw things around, everything would end up, broken, and he was just really, really aggressive.
Today, Cane Love Day is your typical 12-year-old. It's hard to believe 4 years ago, this was the same boy, putting his mum Lauren through hell.
Okay. No, look what you've done! You put holes in the door! He was abusive. He used to hit me and punch me and kick me and bite me.
How did that make you feel?
Helpless. I didn't know what to do with him.
He put a pillow on my head and sat on it.
Kane's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, was out of control.
Alright.
Older sister Tara was terrified.
I just didn't want to go near him because I was afraid of him.
What are you like now?
I'm happier. I'm able to concentrate. Yeah.
You get along with people better?
Yeah, I get along with my mum well.
Okay, Kane, I want you to get the green rocket ship to fire up.
After years of violent outbursts, finally relief. In what looks to be a simple computer game.
It works for depression, it works for mood disturbances, it works for panic. I've used it successfully with chronic pain, headaches.
It's called Neurofeedback, a a system where clinical psychologist Dr. Moshe Pearl says Kane's brainwaves are represented as different coloured spaceships.
Yellow. So the purple and the yellow rocket ships from firing up.
Dr. Pearl says electrodes on Kane's head sense when he's relaxed and focused, and as a result, the green spaceship speeds up, overtaking the other spaceships that show when he's tired or tense.
What he wants to do is get the rockets to go fast, so he teaches himself really to slow down.
Well, what proof do you really have that this works?
Well, the outcomes to me are the evidence.
He could. Absolutely excellent results, and it's been long term, and he's lost, like I would say, all his violence.
Do you have your little boy back?
Oh, look, I never had him to start with, but yes, I have a little boy now, you know, and it's fabulous.
Don't stab me. Don't.
Looking back, Kane hardly recognises himself.
Can't believe I was like that.
Could you ever be like that again?
Nah.
You don't think so?
And even if I tried, I don't think I'd be able to do it.
Click the button anytime you see the white square.
Dr. Pearl tests Kane's attention span. After 60 neurofeedback sessions, his scores have doubled.
Maybe 1 in 10,000 children would have scored as poorly as he did. And now he's completely average in that area.
I can sit down and talk about him. I tell him some secrets that I don't want Mum to know.
Sure, Mum's happy with that.
I just communicate with him a lot more, and it's just happier.
Kane is still weaning himself off the ADHD drug Ritalin, and it was only through donations from the local parish that the Lovedays could afford the $4,800 price tag for his treatment.
It's better and it's safer and it's less invasive than any chemicals or even natural therapies. I mean, we've tried it all, the diets, the whole thing.
What is your success rate?
With ADHD, I'm looking at about 85%.
My mum said there was 2 Kanes of me. Happy Kane and Angry Kane.
So is Angry Kane gone for good?
Hopefully.
Yeah, good on you, Kane. And there's more about the neurofeedback treatment at our website. There's the address, 9msn.com.au/ACA.
Okay. So, the boy, was playing that game entirely with his brain. No hands. There's a sensor on his head, and and he's getting rewarded to make certain frequencies, and every time he makes it, the spaceships he wins the game, okay? So that's all that this is. And it's simple principle, really. You put usually 3 sensors on the head, 1 on the ear, 1 on the head, sometimes 2 on the head, and you put on your computer the frequency that you have the frequency that you think this will help this person. And then they play the video game, and some people will feel it immediately. They'll feel it in the chair, sitting there. They'll feel, oh, this is like meditation, or oh, this is like, I feel calm, or my back, I just relaxed my body. That can happen immediately, sometimes not, but it can. Okay. So to go back to the slides, I just wanted you to make sure you knew that that was all happening with his brain, okay? No hands. So the principle here is that beneath every thought, feeling, and behavior, the brain is firing. Firing is measured in frequencies. The higher the frequencies, simply put, this is just simply put, the higher the frequencies, the higher the arousal. With feedback, a person can change these frequencies. The emphasis in neurofeedback is on brain plasticity, neuronal plasticity, teaching the neurons new ways to fire. Okay? Ready? Okay. There is Donald Hebb, who was a psychologist in Canada, talked about what fires together, wires together. So the more that, for our purposes in trauma, the more that the amygdala fires, the more the neurons in the amygdala wire together, and the more quickly they'll fire the next time. So instead of people getting better with fear disorders, over time they get worse because there's more firing, there's less inhibition. They're wiring together and they're firing together. So when that phone drops on the floor, the person who is already afraid is more afraid each time because the brain is primed. Okay. So every time it fires together, it gets stronger. And this is, for purposes of our survival, fundamentally a good thing that we learn what to be afraid of so that we don't have to learn it every time. So if somebody comes in here with a gun, I know to be afraid. I've already learned the lesson. I don't need to learn it every single time. Well, hopefully not that many times anyone comes in with a gun, but you know what I'm saying. I mean, we need to learn if you touch a hot stove, and then now you know it's hot, so you don't do it again. That's fear circuitry doing its job. When I was just in Roma, all right, and the driving is scary, and I don't want to be trying to figure out how fast the car is coming or what model the car is. I want to get out of the way. That's what the amygdala does. It gets me out of danger, all right? Normally, every one of us has our amygdala functioning that way to help us to survive, all right? So what happens, though, when you're a little baby, a little child, bambino, then what happens is that if you're under stress, the amygdala gets hyperwired. There's a lot of dendritic growth. So I'll show you this in a minute too. But there's more dendrites in the neurons, and there's perfusion of the dendrites in the amygdala, and it kills dendritic growth and neurons in the hippocampus. So it is which is about memory. So we have getting hyperwired for fear and losing our memory of why we're afraid. That, under enough stress, that's what happens in the human brain. Everyone with me? Oh, you're great. I wish I knew Italian. I tried, I couldn't do it. Okay. So what we are trying to do is to change the pattern of firing, and we are successful most of the time. So let me just talk, just to say a little bit about seizure, because I think that seizure, something like a seizure, is what's going on in the brain of trauma survivors. They have something that dysregulated, something, if it's not an outright seizure, it's seizure-like. It's anticonvulsants that we use for people with a lot of emotional lability. So if they are having trouble regulating themselves emotionally, the drug of choice is an anticonvulsant, right? Okay, so that's probably not accidental, that we are using a drug that is being given for epilepsy. If you're a neurologist, you give it for epilepsy. If you're a psychologist, you give it for mood lability. Same problem. It's the brain in turmoil, okay? So what happens with a seizure, and neurofeedback was discovered first for seizures, is that there's a little bit of brain tissue, little bit, in the brain giving off a bad signal. If it was just that little part of the brain that was giving off a bad signal, it wouldn't be a problem. You wouldn't even feel it. No one would know. You wouldn't know. But what happens with a seizure is that it recruits neurons next to it. So more and more, the more neurons that pick up the bad signal, the bigger the seizure event will be. So we have a temporal lobe seizure stays in the temporal lobe, okay? And most of our trauma patients probably have something like temporal lobe epilepsy, something like it, all right? And we know that all of the early research in neurofeedback was on training people who had uncontrollable seizures to learn how to control their seizures. And they could do it. They could all learn to do it. What I'm saying, I guess, is trauma patients can learn this too, and there's a whole reason to consider that we really know that already, and we know that from the seizure literature, which none of us read, because we're psychologists or psychotherapists. Why would we read seizure literature? But this is where brain regulation is our issue. Okay, so it's a difference in the way we view the brain. We're moving from the biochemical, where, as I said, the money is, the drug companies, big pharma, from the discovery of thorazine. This is where we started to look at the brain biochemically. I'm asking all of you, young, bright students that are here, to think about the brain differently, to think about it electrically, okay? So it's like changing the way we think of it from soup to the spark, okay? So when we set somebody up, we have the sensor, as you saw on the film, we have the sensor on the head, and we have on the computer, we have the information about what frequencies we want them to make and what ones we don't want them to make. And we figure that out through a clinical assessment, just the way you do when you figure out your treatment plan. And so when that boy made more of the frequency that calmed him down, the spaceship went out. And the other two spaceships on the side, those were the inhibits, and he had to not make those as well, okay? And when he could do all of that, he got rewarded and gets lots of game, you know. As a friend of mine said, cats needed food, all we need is a little video game, but we'll play for that, okay? So you can also, and we're going to get into all this, but the brain is a net, and it's communicating with itself all the time. So close in and all globally in the brain. So you can train to bring the arousal of the person down, to quiet their arousal, their difficulty with affect regulation, or you can also reward to make more connectivity in the brain. Both of those things are very possible. It's very plastic. The brain is very plastic. So all this is just to give you the terms that I've been using, where the neuron is the nerve cell, the reception and transmission of the electrochemical signal. So chemistry is involved, and that's why medications can work, because it can facilitate the electrical signal. But that's the main objective, and unfortunately, the brain doesn't learn from that, okay? And the brain is all about learning. The axon is the stem, the long stem of the neuron. It transmits a signal. The dendrites the branching ends of the neuron. The synapse is a gap between neurons, and that is where chemistry is involved to facilitate getting the signal from one neuron to the next, and hertz cycles per second, all right? So it's just how many times it goes up and down in a second, all right? So, and all signals, all frequencies are measured in hertz. So neurons transmit and store information electrically. There are 10 trillion synaptic connections in the human brain, right? Over 100 billion neurons, 20 miles, 32 kilometers of axon. Of axons, 10,000 plus neurons have to fire together to even become important to the brain. So it's never one neuron, it's a bundle of at least 10,000 for there to even be a brain wave. What fires together wires together, we talked about that. So the more often they fire together, a bunch of neurons fires together, the more likely they are to fire together the next time, right? That's what memory is, right? Coordinated firings of pools of neurons is really what we're talking about. That's what represents the core of brain function. That's the truth of brain function. If that's the only thing you take away from this lecture, that will be great. And so the neurons are the gray matter, and then there are tracks that are white matter tracks in the brain that are glia cells. Glia cells are also trainable. And in fact, in Italy and in Europe, a lot of neurofeedback focuses on the glial cells and on changing the white matter tracks in the brain. So that's all the potential that sits in this approach to the work. All right, so these are just the different frequencies. We start at the top, and this is this is called beta. This is somebody who's actively thinking, actively engaged in the conversation. Hopefully, most of you are making beta right now, because otherwise, if you're too much down here, I'm losing you. You're starting to fall asleep, okay? This is deep sleep. I don't see anybody here yet. Some of you may be feeling here or here. So these are just different states of arousal, and they've got frequencies to them, right? And so if I want someone to be more relaxed, you come into me and say, I'm driven, I'm unhappy, I might choose alpha. I might put on my screen to say, reward this brain every time it makes alpha. And guess what? You'll start making alpha. Every single person in this room would do that, okay? Either sooner or later. I mean, some brains take longer to learn this, but sooner or later. And so, as you can tell, so there's arousal is embedded in every one of these. And generally speaking, we're going to be training people who have histories of trauma more and more in these lower ranges to help quiet them down. Is that with me? Yeah, okay. Okay. So, as we just said, so sleep is 0 to 4 hertz. There is dreamy and drowsy and creative state where you're not overthinking, you're not thinking too much, you're just open to your experience is theta, 4 to 7 hertz. Relaxed, open focus, this is, I think of this as the Dalai Lama, right? 8 to 11 hertz, although the Dalai Lama can move a lot, but he sort of lives in alpha, I think. We've never talked, but I think. Calm attention is called SMR, sensory motor rhythm, and it's 12 to 15 hertz, and we can train people often in this range too. And alert attention, so if we have somebody who has ADD and has trouble concentrating, you might train them at 15 to 18 hertz to enable their brain to get into the higher frequencies. And then if you get too high and it's braced, and this can happen, you can see this when you're training somebody, you can watch their body brace, and if that starts to happen, you know that you're training them at too high a frequency and you bring it down, okay? All right. So neurofeedback. Biofeedback using the EEG. It's operant conditioning of the brain waves, more or less, okay? We observe the EEG in real time, so we have those sensors with the boy you saw, right? That was his EEG scrolling in real time. It's like 2 milliseconds later, you see the brain wave you just created. Okay. We feed the information back to the trainee, so he saw it on the game, or he could just look at his brain waves, either way. The game is connected to the brain waves. The trainee attempts to meet certain goals, so all we're doing is say, make more alpha. It will. Gradually, the brain adjusts its function, and it will live more and more in the frequencies that it's learned. Okay? So we have somebody who comes in who's over-aroused and distressed. They can learn over time at the level of their brain to relax. Okay? Which is very hard. I mean, how many people, this is for the English speakers among you, how many people have been told to just relax? Any of you been told to just relax? Yeah, just raise your hand if you've been told to just relax, ever. Okay, how possible was that to do? It's very hard to just relax. If you could just relax, you would do that. You wouldn't need to go to a doctor or a high-priced psychologist to be told to just relax. So we learn, and you learn that at the level of the brain. The brain begins to use its newfound skills because the brain loves to learn. That's what the brain does. Once learned, it remembers. The brain is devoted to its own regulation. It's when it makes mistakes that we see a psychopathology, and we're training the brain not to make these errors. So really you can think about neurofeedback as a mirror for the brain, so it gets to watch its own evolving regulation, its own evolving capacity. Okay, so this is the fundamental thesis, neurons fire. Right? That represents arousal in the brain. So this is just words, arousal in the brain. And arousal translates to emotion in the mind. So when we talk about the mind, we're talking about emotion. When we're talking about the brain, we're talking about arousal. We practice the state, the affect or emotion often enough, it becomes a state. It's not just passing emotion, it's a state. It's weather. It's like weather. It's like, rain or sun, I guess. There's always a narrative that goes along with it. So if somebody makes me angry, I will, first of all, I'll say they made me angry rather than I experienced anger. I will have a justifying narrative. I will have a way of speaking about it that reinforces the way I feel. Does that make sense to people, generally? Okay. Well, we'll talk more about it. So then you practice these states long enough, they become your traits, they become more like who you are. This is just who I am, and we identify with all of this. So we go from the level of neurons firing, 10,000 or so in a bunch, all right? And doing this either in a well or poorly organized way leads to the level of arousal. That is the arousal in the brain. That then translates to the way we feel. We feel that enough. We are in a state. We have always have a reason for the reason we say we're in the state because of something. And if we're in that state long enough, it becomes a trait, and we begin to identify. So if all that we have are our feelings, then we're going to be, we either have no self or we're just going to be a fear-based self. The woman who did the drawing that looked like an insect, the drawing of self, she very much wanted to be rid of her fear. She wanted it gone. She was terrified of it being gone. And she was terrified of it being gone because she didn't know who she'd be if she wasn't afraid. She had no sense of herself not afraid. So we're beginning with these fear-based traits. This is again in trauma, in people with trauma and early childhood trauma. And we'll see high arousal as a baseline state. We see chronically, vaguely mediated illnesses like irritable bowel syndrome, constipation, diarrhea. Those are all vagal issues. And the vagus is very much controlled. I mean, it's the highway, superhighway between the brain and the gut. High levels of emotional reactivity. So in your therapy, this is somebody who gets angry easily, who gets negative transference, lots of negative behaviors in the therapy. So we'll see this in developmental trauma, we'll see it in attachment disorder, we see it in PTSD, borderline personality, antisocial personality disorder, all of the real heavy hitters. Are we still with this? Okay. And we also, these are the traits that I've been talking about, the fear-based traits are what it qualifies in the DSM as axis 2. These are people that are completely bound by their emotions, okay? And anxiety disorders, most depressions, phobias, OCD, autism, ADHD, these are all have affect as a component piece, and we can treat that. Borderline personality, that's what BPD is, and APD, antisocial personality disorder, arise from neglect and abuse. Okay, that was, if you were a child, developmental trauma disorder. This is not a disorder accepted by the DSM, but it is developmental trauma is increasingly what people are using. Lacking a sense of self, people identify with these feelings. They are their feelings. We've all had patients like this, or you will. They have fear and shame-based identities. And what I am saying is that all of these personality disorders are actually disorders of high subcortical arousal. Okay? Okay. All right, so what we hope for with neurofeedback is neurons fire, but they're now regulated and they're subcortically quieter. Arousal is lower and well-regulated, so full range of affective states are available. So you could feel joy, excitement, lethargy, everything's available, but calm prevails, right? The state becomes flexible, calm, often happy, and this is people who have never experienced happiness, and peaceful. The narrative that they give it as it arises and seen for what it is. So they hear what they're saying to themselves. This is a little hard to do without language, common language, I'm realizing. The sense of self, the traits, the way they are, this is who I am, that starts to give way as well. So they are, they begin to reorganize their sense, they begin to get a sense of self. We go back and remember that first fMRI picture where there was no blood flow. That would now start to show up. You would see blood flow in the same patients where there was no blood flow. They reorganize their sense of self, and it is pro-social. The very interesting thing that happens is that when there is a sense of self, it is always pro-social. Antisocial behavior is, by definition, an indication that there is no sense of self in that person. All right? So the people in our prisons, or the people, unfortunately, who run many of our corporations, probably have no good sense of self and other. All right? Okay. And when fear goes away with these traumatized patients, when fear is greatly reduced, they have to have a whole new sense of self. That's required. And that's where the therapy comes in, because you have to help them as the therapist with developing a new sense of relatedness and understanding that this is who they are. I had a patient come in who I've been working with for a long time. She had sexually abused as a child. She had Asperger's. She had pretty severe PTSD, or developmental trauma. And she came in and she described an interaction with her sister. And I said, Catherine, that's empathy. She said, oh, that's what empathy is. She'd never had an experience of empathy. She was very bright, she was very smart, but she had never felt anything. And so she was surprised at herself. She didn't understand this. And I had to help her understand what she was experiencing. Okay? Okay. So what we would look at in a transition with people who are traumatized, who come in and do work with neurofeedback, or even that boy who is theoretically not traumatized, the ADHD boy, I don't know what his history is. He was about to be taken off to juvenile justice when he started neurofeedback. So what you start to see are noticeable reduction in fear and symptoms related to high arousal. Symptoms start to disappear. This can be a problem when you've identified with your symptoms. The patient begins to use the language of arousal and regulation instead of trauma or pathology. They stop pathologizing themselves. They realize that they're over-aroused at this moment, okay? And they start using that language. That's a clear indication that neurofeedback is beginning to happen, is beginning to help their brain. They emerge in erratic steps from the timeless dark hollows of the fear-driven brain, and this is the way it is. Where these people live is so awful, so uncharted for themselves and for us, really, in the field. And they start to come out of it. It is like watching light come into their eyes. And as one person who for 3 years, this didn't always happen fast, but it happens. So one woman, who I'll show you in a minute if we have time, who was had been doing 20 years of psychotherapy, all kinds of psychotherapy, came in, started to do neurofeedback. She was the one who was afraid of losing the fear. At one point said about her trauma, which she just wanted to talk about endlessly, was it just wasn't relevant anymore. And that was an astounding moment. You just don't hear that in psychotherapy. At least I don't. And I've been working with traumatized people my entire career. Neurofeedback shifts the burden of affect regulation from the therapist to the trainee. So although you're present and supportive and you have to be in this with your patient, the affect regulation isn't up to you. You don't have to take calls at midnight, right? You don't have to put people in hospitals. I have not hospitalized anybody since starting neurofeedback, right? You are working, you're working with the brain as an ally, and you're not the one, you have to make the decisions to help the brain, to make sure that you're training the brain correctly, and that requires training. And hopefully training that will be done at university soon, So you have to learn how to do it, but you're not the one responsible for the regulation of your patient. And for those of you who have worked with trauma, borderline personality disorder, that's all you're called upon to do, is to regulate their feeling states. It's not understanding it much as it is to regulate it with your person, with your compassion, with your empathy. And it's hard when somebody is fearful and raging and full of shame to have any of that really affect them. Okay. I hope you're all with me. Okay. So changes can be profound and quick. They're not always. I don't want to, and not everybody responds to neurofeedback. The vast majority of people do, but not everybody. But as I said earlier, the absence of symptoms can challenge the sense of identity. There's an integration of new state, new traits, and a new sense of self. That becomes the clinical task. It's not regulating affect. It's not even really deeply understanding, although some patients will still want to do insight work, and it'd be very valuable for people who want to do it, to do insight work. But really the focus now is on affect regulation and the self that develops as a result. So the summary of this talk is that the brain can learn to regulate itself even when it's severely disorganized. Neurofeedback is used for major head trauma, for concussion, post-concussive syndrome, for TBI, traumatic brain injury. This is the top of the line treatment for those conditions. Plasticity is primarily in the electrical domain of the brain, and that's what we are accessing with this mirror called neurofeedback. The use of medications does not teach the brain. The brain relies on the medication like a crutch, right? But it doesn't teach the brain to walk. Neurofeedback gets the brain up walking and talking. Optimal learning depends on optimal firing. This is, again, really just what we've been talking about. Fear is a core emotion in mental illness, and most of you will know that already. So the training goal in most mental illnesses, not all, but the training goal in most is reduction of fear and general emotional regulation. So it's regulation of the brain and lowering arousal. Brainwave training enhances timing in the brain and contributes to peak performance. So the Milan soccer team that won the World Cup used neurofeedback. All right? I don't know what they've done since, but the team that won the World Cup used neurofeedback, and they used it together as a team. All right, so I was ask those of you who are following me in English, what age do you think this child was who drew this? Just tell me an age. What age do you think? How old? 5? Good, thanks. It doesn't matter. It's all trick, okay? So if you tell it, you just call it out. And what age this drawing, do you think? Just guess. 7, 6, 7? Yeah, okay. Get older. And this? 10, 11? Okay. So this is the way this goes. So this is a child who is actually 10, begins neurofeedback in August. And that's his representation of him, of family. He is this one. He's older. This is his younger sister. This is him, mother and father. Okay. And this is his drawing. This is his drawing a month later. So what you're seeing is a nervous system organizing, right? And this is at the end of neurofeedback, 40 sessions of neurofeedback 4 months later. That's the change in the nervous system that's possible. And I think that's really all you should need to see to want to get interested in this field, is what you saw just there, okay? And we see that over and over. In fact, when you're working with kids, it's a very good idea to have them draw themselves, their families. So you'll see this. You'll see it organized like this. So the TOVA is the test of variables of attention. It's a computer game that boy was playing on the video. And for our purposes now, all we're going to see is that it gets better. This is a test that's usually used for Ritalin and for the dosing of Ritalin, but we find it's a very helpful thing to see. So at the beginning, go back. Oh, we're not seeing this slide. What should I do? Oh, thank you. I just need bidirectionality. Okay. All right. So this is the beginning. This is in attention and ability to pay attention. This is this is in 53 subjects. So this is what it is. This is after 20 sessions of neurofeedback, and this is more like 40. Same with impulsivity. So the beginning and the middle and the end. This is how quickly they can hit the button. So response time, that gets better. And variability is how different it is each time. And variability is a huge factor in brain injury. So it's how much difference there is when they do push the button, how much longer or shorter it is. That also gets better. So this is only on 9 subjects, but it is a very significant study. What they're seeing is this is before pre-treatment. The pink is post-treatment, and the blue now is 12 months with no treatment. So what does that say? What that says is that, so this is where they are when they finish neurofeedback, is the pink. And then when they go back, no treatment for a year, and they retest them with the same test, what they see is the brain has learned it. It's not only learned it, it's gotten better at its own regulation, okay? So this is this boy that we were just talking, that we saw in the video. So his beginning is white. This is a little hard to see. The checked, this is on Ritalin. The green is with neurofeedback, and the black is after the end. This is after he was one of the people retested after a year. So those are his changes. Pretty significant. And that boy was headed into juvenile detention. So the review of findings. So Frank Duffy is the head of neuroimaging at and research at Children's Hospital, very, very important hospital research hospital in Boston. And he conducted an independent review, this is some time ago, of the literature on neurofeedback, which is growing in leaps and bounds. More and more papers being published in neurofeedback every year. And some of you may do that. Right? Okay. So when he looked at what this was, he said, the literature, which lacks any negative study of substance, suggests that EEG biofeedback therapy should play a major therapeutic role in many difficult areas. In my opinion, if any medication had demonstrated such a wide spectrum of efficacy, it would be universally accepted and widely used. Well, guess what? See the number of people in the room? How universally accepted this is, or how widely used? Not yet. But this is where we have to go. This is the future, to me, of the field of psychotherapy. You can't be better than your brain. I ask you all, learn neurofeedback, and I thank you. Grazie. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good, good. Thank you so much.
Bene, grazie di cuore a Sebern Fischer per questa bellissima relazione e anche per le notizie importanti che ci ha portato su come connettere il neurofeedback con la psicoterapia. Molti dei presenti sono allievi e altri invece sono già terapeuti, quindi abbiamo un orizzonte che si apre. Ora, se c'è qualche domanda che vogliamo rivolgere alla professoressa Fischer, chi la fa in inglese e chi invece preferisce rivolgere in italiano, ci sarà una collega che traduce la domanda in modo che si può comunicare nelle due lingue.
I have a video of the woman who drew the picture. Would you like to see it?
Oh, yes.
Okay, let's do that. And
Yes, thank you.
did we put this on? Okay, so they're going to do it from up there? John, how does this work? Okay, I have to have
What
faith.
people are seeing now is somebody who is 200% different than they were 8 years ago. Me, I'm a different person now. I am a full person now. I experienced incest at about 2 years old with my father, and through 10 through 12 at least through my grandfather and the boy next door. I never remembered what happened with my father or my grandfather. I blanked it out. The brain is a wonderful organ until my first child was born, and he was about 3 years old, and then I fell apart.
What did falling apart look like for you?
Falling apart looked like my worst. I was suicidal. I had tried to overdose on Tylenol. I was a registered nurse, and that means I had access to things like scalpels, and I would cut myself over and over again. If I remember it then, the pain was so excruciating. I needed just bizarre concept of trying to get the pain out by cutting myself. That makes no sense to me today at all. But I was in desperate straits. I was hospitalized several times, made admitted to a state hospital, and I managed to avoid that. What started me on the road was Marsha Lenehan and DBT. Because of that and that program, I no longer was suicidal. I could control it. I could control the urges to do that. I was sleeping.
But did you still have the urges?
You know, it was a different lifetime. It's hard to remember that now. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. I probably still did, but I was able to hold on to it. DBT was important in that it helped me do that, but yet it was hard for me to take hold of the concepts and actually work with them. I was on medication. I was on like 13 different pills at one time. I was going through the regular therapy for well over 10 years or more, and I can remember every time I went, it was excruciating. I could never tell anybody anything because it was just too painful. And when I left the sessions, I would be crying. I just couldn't do it. I remember describing that I felt like I had a big hole inside me. It was just empty. I was a nothing. There was nothing to me. I I came in just by chance to Sebern because my therapist at the time was going to be away for a month. And so they decided, to have me try neurofeedback. And for 1 month, and then I went back to this therapist, and I just kept telling her things, one after another, after another, after another. Her jaw dropped. She couldn't believe that this is the same person a month ago that couldn't say anything. So just 1 month did wonders.
Wow, right, I remember that.
Yeah, I was abusive. I was pulling my hair. I was hitting myself. Yeah, I was a mess.
You'd ask for ice.
Oh, that was something to do with DBT. To help.
To give yourself some pain stimulus to redirect the brain, I think.
Yeah.
I think that, if I remember this correctly, and it's been a while, that you had about 19 years of psychotherapy when you came here.
I was going to trust you on that because I know it was a very long time. I just don't remember.
It was psychodynamic, and it was behavioral, and it was trauma focused, and your partner. I don't know what's happened to this. Okay. She had almost 20 years of psychotherapy, psychodynamic therapy, DBT, and she had really tried. When she arrived at my office after 20 years of psychotherapy and group therapy, individual therapy, and 14 different medications, she was pounding her face, she was clawing her eyes, she would leave completely fallen apart. And as she said, within a month of doing neurofeedback, she was no longer doing this, which is a good thing because I had to intervene to stop her from hurting herself. And that's just not gonna be a psychotherapy that can ever work, right? And so she got herself more and more organized, but she still had dissociative episodes for a year into neurofeedback training. She still had flashbacks. When she came, she had as many as 5 flashbacks a day, right? And this is after 20 years of therapy, okay? All the best, treatment, all kinds of drugs. She's off all medication. She was able to work for three hours at a time and would have to go home. She'd usually binge eat, go home and go to bed. She now has 2 demanding professional jobs. She worked at a hardware store. And a lot of men go into hardware stores because it's what men do. And every time a strange man would come, she would flatten herself against the shelf. She would be that scared, and she was always seeing that. She would be exhausted by the end of the day. So what she was dealing with was so overwhelming and so beyond the reach of what we can do with any standard therapy. I just wanted to give you an idea of how she is today and how different her life is. And it wasn't, and you know, she thinks that I'm a good therapist. Well, that's fine. That's okay. I am okay. But no, this isn't the therapy. I could never have done with this without the help of neurofeedback. Okay, that's all. Thanks. So questions, right? Questions? We have 10 minutes for questions.
My name is Cristiana Grazioli. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm trying to use neurofeedback, and my question is, how can we use neurofeedback when patients use medicines?
I haven't found that this woman was on 14 meds, 14, okay, different psychotropics, and I think most of our patients are going to come in on medication, and it affects the brain waves, but you can train through medications. It probably will take longer, particularly benzodiazepines seem to slow down the progress of neurofeedback. She was on a lot of benzodiazepines and it took a while. But even she was on atypical antipsychotic, SSRIs, benzodiazepines. I once said to her, if you keep making your psychiatrist crazy, he's going to put you on more meds. All right? So she was on lots of meds and slowly but surely came off them as her arousal came down. So there is no contraindication with training and medications.
Difficult to understand how the training is going on. To me, it's difficult to understand what is about the medicines and what is about the training.
Right, right. Well, that's always with any treatment, right? You're going to do a baseline assessment of their arousal, and if they're on meds, right? So you see the person who's in front of you, they're on meds. Yeah. You do a baseline assessment of how frightened they are, essentially. And if you quiet that fear, it's not the meds, it's the training. Because you know what the limits of the medications are, because you know your patient. And if the patient starts to get less fearful, it's not because their meds are kicking in, it's because their brain is starting to work differently. Seizure patients, massive seizures, they come off anticonvulsants. Well, because the brain is organizing itself so that they don't no longer need the same dose. So the dose comes down, and then after a while, they're off the anticonvulsant altogether because the brain is organizing itself and no longer needs the medication.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, sure. Absolutely. I'm game if you are.
Okay, and what about combining neurofeedback with other, I'm an MDR therapist, so someone use neurofeedback to prepare using MDR, so what do you think about this?
I think there's no contradiction. I think whatever is the best therapy, whether it's EMDR or DBT, skills training, very helpful for people who are going through regulating their brains. There's no, again, it's so focused on regulating the brain and on lowering arousal that the problem with EMDR can be that there can be a big flare-up of arousal, right? So if that's happening and you have access to neurofeedback, then you would want to train this person to organize their brains, and then perhaps they would need EMDR. She had lots of EMDR, right? It didn't help her. She would get over-aroused. It would re-traumatize her, which can happen. Rather than a breakthrough, it re-traumatize her. And so organizing her brain and quieting her arousal made every therapy more available to her.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, if you don't have any questions, I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.